Welcome to Rising Tide Startups, where today's most exciting solopreneurs share their startup stories. They also deliver tangible strategies that they would implement personally if starting their business over today. Each episode is a startup masterclass. Make sure you take notes. Take it away, Kevin.
This is Kevin Pruitt with another episode of Rising Tide Startups, and my guest today is David Friedman. David, thank you for joining us on Rising Tide.
Oh, totally my pleasure, Kevin. Great to be with you.
It's great on our little pre-chat here we had right before I hit the big record button, and it's amazing how in this massive world we live in of 7.2 billion people that we would know people and have relatives that literally lived a half a mile from each other.
Yes.
So it is an amazing story to catch up on. But David, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I live in southern New Jersey. It's where I grew up. And my background is that I spent 27 years building an employee benefits consulting company. And I grew that company from a couple of people to over 100 people. And during the years that I was growing that company, we were very successful in almost every way you can look at. But I would tell you that the foundation of all of our success, practically all of it, was based on the culture that we had built in the company. And as the CEO of the company, I did a lot of things in a very intentional way to make that happen. We eventually ended up selling the company to a large multi-billion-dollar publicly held company. I worked for a couple of years there running our company as a division of this much bigger entity. Mm-hmm. And then back in 2010, I retired from that industry. And I ended up writing a book about the things that we had done that made us so successful. And that book was called Fundamentally Different. And I wrote that book, I'm always honest about this, Kevin. I wrote that book as a closure step, as a way of wrapping up my old career in a nice bow so I could put it behind me and I could go on and do something totally and completely different. And little did I know it wasn't going to quite work out that way. And people started reading the book and they got a lot of value from it. And what ended up happening, which was kind of the signature event, is as people read it, people started asking me if I would come to speak to their groups, typically CEO groups, about the things that I had written about. And as people heard me speak, people said, hey, that's pretty interesting. Could I hire you to help me do that in my company? And the next thing I knew, I got very unretired and I was traveling around the country, helping businesses. And since that time, this morning I did my 542nd workshop on this material. So I've been around the country speaking to thousands and thousands of CEOs. I've written 3 books on this material. I've built another company, High Performing Culture and CultureWise, that brings this process that I created to people. And it's just been game changing for people. But it's very simple.
Well, you did is like the cardinal sin of introductions. You did such a thorough job of introducing yourself that I had about 10 questions going on in my mind as you were, and I'm going to have to remember them as we chat about them. But you touched on something that is really interesting to me with like your transition from your first company. So, we've had some prior guests that have had the pleasure or the blessing of an exit, and either stayed on to transition or, kind of phased out pretty quickly. But walk us through the day, the Friday that you sign and the Monday that you come back in and you're like, I'm actually an employee of my previous company. So walk us through the feeling of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I would say there was a key moment a number of months before that. And the moment, and I think all business owners go through this. And the moment was when I had this recognition that what I had built was an asset. And when I say that, what I mean by that, the reason that's significant is as soon as you understand that your company is an asset, no different than a house or money or anything else, the implication of that is that there's a good chance that someday you're going to sell that asset. And the question then simply becomes, well, when, to whom, under what circumstances, right, and for what amount. Right. But it's an asset to be sold at some point.
It's not a child? It's not a family member. It
really isn't.
It's not a treasured possession that you have birthed.
That's exactly it. That's a really important understanding. And that doesn't mean, for your listeners' sake, saying that it's an asset doesn't mean, I don't care about the people, or I don't have any emotional attachment to it. It doesn't mean any of that at all. So I don't say that in a like hard-edged, cutthroat kind of way, but it is an asset. And as soon as you accept that, you're going to sell this someday. And so you don't spend a lot of time. I didn't spend a lot of time after that when I recognized that, you know, thinking, oh my God, I could never do this.
Sure.
And so when I understood that and I made the decision that the time was right, and I would say for me, and this may or may not be similar to other guests of yours, for me, I never intended to spend my life selling insurance. Like, who grows up saying, man, if I could get into the insurance business, that would be my dream someday. Like, who wants to do that? And so I was always kind of honest about the fact that I never even liked it. What I loved our company. We built a fantastic company with amazing people. And oh, by the way, coincidentally, the industry happened to be insurance and employee benefits.
I mean, that'd be my question.
Yes.
I mean, does it matter? I mean, if you're making widgets, I mean, it wouldn't have mattered. So,
it doesn't
I mean,
matter
at that stage.
It doesn't. And so I think because I never saw myself spending the rest of my life in that industry,
right.
It wasn't hard for me to let go of that. I realized that that wasn't my future. And so I think I had, to a great extent, I had accomplished all that I was interested in accomplishing at that point. I was always much more interested in leadership, in organizational dynamics, and how do you build an amazing organization. That was way more interesting to me than insurance. I was a philosophy major at William and Mary. And so my background is more philosophical. So I was always more interested in that. So to answer your question, when it came time to leave, it was like, I'm ready to leave. It's time to move on.
Did you know how long you're going to be there? I mean, when you sold the company, was the contract like, okay, I'm going to spend 24 months, I'm spending 18 months to transition? And
sort of. So the answer to that, the reason I say sort of is I had a 3-year contract. The acquirer actually hoped and expected that I would stick around for the rest of my career. And many of their acquisitions do that. That they're bringing in people who will grow within the larger organization, and they had that hope for me. I went into it open to that possibility, but doubting that, given that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in that industry. And so I realized within a year that I don't want to do this anymore. And it wasn't anything to do with them being the acquirer. They were good people. So it's not like they came in and screwed up our company. Good people. I just don't want to be in this business anymore. So what ended up happening actually is I went to them and I said, look, I'm going to leave at the end of the 3 years that I agreed to, but we could do this in a couple different ways. Wouldn't it be a better idea if I left earlier and we could name my successor, I could coach and mentor him so that there's a nice, smooth transition, and then I could leave earlier and you don't have to pay me anymore and you save budget dollars. Isn't that a better plan? So once they accepted the fact that I wasn't going to spend the rest of my career there, I was done in a little less than 2 years of my 3-year
And plus,
contract.
they don't have a lame duck, division head either that is like,
it's not
going into work and thinking, okay, what's next? I'm actually Googling,
exactly. It's not healthy for the organization, for anybody. So once you accept that, my plan to exit sooner was a smarter plan for everybody.
Right. So let's go back to your first company. And you said the company really was successful because of the culture that was built. Outline that culture in like 4 bullet points or 5 bullet points. I mean, did you have like, here's the 5 pillars of our culture that we are going to build around? Just walk us through those real quickly.
So to do that, I'll try to do that. But as we talk more, understanding what I teach today, what I teach today is based on what we did. So we practiced what I call a set of fundamentals. So fundamentals are behaviors that we teach, and I'll explain more of this later in our discussion. But fundamentals are a set of behaviors that I created for our company and that we taught, and we focused on one fundamental every week, and we cycle through them week after week after week, doing a series of activities around them. And so the creation of this concept of what I call fundamentals was really the signature of my career. And it's really what led to our success. And that's what I wrote the first book about. And that's what launched all this other stuff. And that's what I teach people today.
So it's a great segue. So
Yes.
kind of walk us through those,
Yeah.
we can come up to modern day time, and you're
Yes.
doing a presentation. Kind of walk us through the basic framework of what you teach
Yeah.
today.
So the first thing I would say, Kevin, is that if we understand that the culture in any organization, I don't care whether it's a company, a sports team, a family, a church group, whatever, that the culture has an enormous influence over everything that happens. And if we understand that, the implication of that to me is that as leaders, if we had a way to be more systematic about creating that culture instead of just hoping it's going to work out, that would be a smart thing to do. And that's what I teach people how to do. Now, the way that I teach people to do it is I organize the steps that it takes to be really systematic, because my point of view is you should be as systematic about your culture as you are about your sales, operations, finance, and every other part of the company.
Mm-hmm.
So the way to do that, I organize the steps around a framework that I call the 8-step framework. 8 different things. You do these 8 things, this is how you do it. But if we really cut to the chase, there are 2 of the steps that probably account for 90% of the impact. And those 2 things are as follows. The first is, and they're very simple, is that you've got to define in really clear terms exactly what you want your culture to be, because you can't create it if you don't know what you're trying to create. Now,
Right.
that sounds simple, except most companies don't do it well. So most companies, and most of your listeners are in companies where they have the typical vision, mission, values. And it sounds great and it looks wonderful on the website, and it's mostly a bunch of fluff and doesn't really mean much. And it's hard to operationalize. It's just too generic. I make a really big deal about the difference between what I call values and what I call behaviors. And the difference is really important. It's not just semantic. So a value is an abstract concept: quality, integrity, loyalty, respect, etc. A behavior is an action, something people do. So some of the behaviors I teach in my own company are things like honor commitments, practice blameless problem solving, be a fanatic about response time. These are actions. And so a value is an idea, behavior is an action. The reason that that distinction is relevant is that because the values tend to be so abstract, they mean too many different things to different people, and they become very difficult to operationalize. What you mean by respect is different than what I mean by respect. And so
For sure.
it's hard to coach people about their values.
Right.
Behaviors, because they're actions, you can teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. So the first step is to define in really clear terms the behaviors that the leader says, if our people did these things consistently, watch out, would be amazing. And those behaviors, my nomenclature for that is I call them fundamentals. So the fundamentals I was referring to before, that's the list of behaviors that we say, this is what we want our culture to be. Now, the second step is really the game changer. And again, this is very simple. The second step is a concept that I call creating rituals. So a ritual is some kind of a routine, a habit. You go to a ball game, we do the national anthem. You wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth. They're just routines. And the reason that rituals are so important to success is that most people, and therefore most companies, stink at sticking with things.
Mm-hmm.
We start that diet and exercise program that doesn't last. We roll out the program at work that doesn't last. People stink at it. When something becomes a ritual, it's no longer difficult to do. You don't struggle to brush your teeth in the morning, I hope. It's just part of your routine.
Right.
So once it becomes part of the routine, it's not hard to do. So the way we use that simple thought is we take these fundamentals, these behaviors, we roll it out into a company in really interactive, engaged sessions, and then we begin to focus on one fundamental every week through a series of rituals. So, and I'll give you an example in just a second. So week number 1, everybody in the company all week long is thinking about working on, focusing on fundamental number 1. The week after that, everybody's on number 2 and 3 and 4, and you just keep cycling through them. So a simple example so that your listeners understand, an example of a ritual. I do this in my company, and all of our clients do. Every meeting that we have in our company this week, the first agenda item of the meeting is the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 to 5 minutes talking about it. What does it mean? How do we practice it? What makes it difficult? Just 3, 4, 5 minutes exploring it. So this could be a Zoom meeting, it could be an in-person meeting. Every meeting everywhere in the company this week starts with that being the first agenda item. Next week, every meeting starts with fundamental number 2. And the week after that, number 3, and so on. So we create a number of rituals like that that give us lots of chances all week long to think about, work on, practice, focus on this week's fundamental. And if we do that week after week after week, sooner or later, those behaviors become internalized. So in its simplest form, the way that I often describe this is I say, if you want to really drive a culture through a company, what you have to do is you've got to define in really clear terms the behaviors that drive success in the company. And then you've got to create a structured, systematic way to teach those behaviors over and over and over and over and over and over again. And if you do that, people will internalize those behaviors. It's really that simple. And what I've done is just build the whole methodology. So that's what we did at RSI, my first company. And I've just built a whole toolkit around how to help a company do that, which is very simple.
Let me ask you, how do you, or what's the transition period? So you've built these rituals, you know, that really are kind of replacing your mission, vision, values, whatever.
Yeah.
So tell me, how often are these reviewed? I mean, it's like, you know, the way you described it, someone like you set the rituals in place, you just repeat them, you know, once a week, every 4 to 8 week cycle or whatever the cycle is. And then you start again and you do the same things over and over and over again. But is there an annual review process? Is there a, every 5 years, we're going to look and see if these rituals still make sense?
Well, yes and no. So let's make a distinction between reviewing the rituals and reviewing the fundamentals. So the fundamentals, when we work on the set of fundamentals, my language for this is I say to people that we should work on them with what I call an intention of permanence. So what I mean by that phrasing is that we're going to put the work into it to really try to nail this with the expectation that this is going to last forever. And we're not going to change these. Now, it's an intention, so we reserve the right to change it if something comes up, but we're not every 3 or 5 years reviewing our fundamentals to see what we want to change. These are enduring documents, enduring principles. And what would change in our marketplace that would have me say, that honoring commitment stuff, way outdated. We don't need to do that anymore. Or we got to start blaming more people. We can blame more people. We'll be more successful. It's a new world.
Blame the person decade.
Exactly. So these are enduring principles that they're universal. Right. So it's not like you're not allowed to, but we're going into it expecting that these are going to last forever. Now, the rituals we practice, we can change those anytime. So, you know, if you find it's not working as well, do some different things. And most companies do a variety of rituals. There's a mobile app that I created about a year ago that creates all kinds of ways that companies and employees engage in their fundamental every single day. So we're always creating new ideas, and our clients do new things for how do we practice it. What stays the same is this week we're on number 1, next week we're on number, that cycle stays the same, but you could do any number of different things to work on it.
So how do these integrate with like goals, like annual goals or whatever? Is there any overlap, or is this kind of the foundational principles of the company, and then the goals are maybe the things that are adaptable on an annual basis or that type of thing?
I think of it more the latter, Kevin, that this is the foundation of how we operate as a company.
Right.
Whatever our goals are, those are strategic in the sense that where are we trying to go? What's our marketplace condition? What new things are we trying to do? And I would say that it really is the foundation, because whatever those goals are, you're going to go a lot further with them if you've got the right culture. Right. And a lot of your listeners have probably read or heard Patrick Lencioni. And in some of his books, he talks about what he calls the multiplier effect, that for whatever given level of product, service, strategy you have, you're going to go 3, 4, 5, 10 times as far if you've got a highly functioning group of people driving that strategy or that product or service, and you're going to go a fraction as far if you've got a screwed up dysfunctional group of people.
Right. I was going to say, and vice versa.
Exactly. It is. And so it is really I think of the culture. It's the foundation that enables your people to put in place and execute upon whatever the strategy is.
So I want to push back on you just a little bit about this, the idea of the fundamentals. And this even goes back to our pre-chat before I hit the button, you know, where you said, you know, this was kind of the value system or the what you say, the culture that you
Mhm.
instilled in your initial company. But I would venture to bet that this actually was instilled in you as an athlete at a young age. Just the
Mhm.
whole foundational idea of fundamentals. I mean, I think back of the old Green Bay Packer football
Yeah.
team in the 60s,
Yeah.
they had like four plays they
Yeah.
ran, but they were going to beat you at those four plays because they
Yeah.
ran them so well. And
Yeah.
that's, as you were describing this, it was like the idea that we are going to execute
Yes.
so well that, you know, and everyone is going to be on the same page. We're going to be running the
And that's
same
exactly
play.
right. There's, I think you're absolutely right, Kevin. I would agree with that. That there, one of the things that I hear sometimes, so one of the questions we get from clients is we'll help them develop their fundamentals, and they'll ask the question, well, I don't know if these feel that unique. And I say to them, they're not, because if you look at what makes great people successful and great companies successful, the way that I describe this is I say, it's right in line with what you just said, is I say that the great ones they don't do anything so unusual. They do what I call ordinary things with extraordinary consistency.
Hmm.
To use the football term, they do the
Yep.
blocking and tackling better than everybody else.
Yep.
It's, we should honor our commitments. That's a novel concept. Gee, do what you say you're going to do. Hey, this isn't like some big secret,
Right.
but most companies suck at it.
Yep.
So, if we were 20% better at making sure that every time somebody said, I got this, you knew with absolute certainty it was going to be done, how much more effective would the company
Right.
be?
Right. I mean,
It's
I
just,
love that.
yeah.
I was literally watching, just had the kind of TV on in the
Mhm.
background about an hour ago, and there was this commercial that came on, and it was a call center, and they were receiving inbound calls into their like complaint center, and they were picking up the phones and putting them back down. And the manager of the call center was going, an unanswered call is not a complaint. So I'm thinking, how poor companies are sometimes
Yes,
at execution. But as I
exactly.
was looking at some of the seminars that you had done, and just kind of looking back at
Mhm.
your history through your website, and I mean, like I said earlier, that you got an unbelievable record of testimonials on that website. I mean, if anybody, I encourage everybody to go to culturewise.com and just look at the number of clients that have given video testimonials. But how do you, I mean, I've been in the business world for a very long time as well. I mean, I have been to an innumerable number of seminars and sessions and strategy plans and Franklin planner stuff and Covey and Lencioni, just almost ad nauseum, productivity, that type of thing. So how do you get companies to move from information to application? And I mean, you have to be pretty effective at this, because
Yes,
otherwise companies would just stop calling, because
yes,
that would have a very short shelf life.
yeah,
Companies, we bought a program, we didn't do it.
yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it to anybody else, because it didn't have any impact on our company. So you obviously have,
Yep.
kind of found a secret here. So how do you get companies to
Yeah,
actually do that?
yeah, that's a great question. So I would answer that in two ways, Kevin. The first thing I'd say is that when I do all these workshops that I do, or when people read my books, what strikes them most and what I hear the most from people is they say, finally, somebody has like lifted the veil and made this stuff clear instead of a bunch of BS.
Mm,
And and it's the clarity and the simplicity of what I teach that causes people to say, oh, that makes sense. How come I never thought about it like that before? So
right.
the first part of the answer is what I teach is so logical and so practical that it just makes sense to people. And that's what causes them to love to do it. The second piece of this, which is related, is that, and I think a lot of this comes because I was and am a CEO, as opposed to thinking of myself as a consultant,
Right.
um, I come at everything from a very practical standpoint.
Hmm.
That my view is if it's not practical, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And it's got to be simple, it's got to be easy to implement, it's got to be easy to sustain, or it's not going to work. It doesn't matter how brilliant it sounds, that if it's complicated, it's just not going to last.
Hmm.
And so everything I do, I look at through that lens. So when I look at how we bring companies through this, I mean, I've broken it down to a very specific process. In fact, the product that we call our product CultureWise, that the system that we use, and and I say to our people and to the world, our team, we are not culture consultants. We are implementers of the CultureWise system. And the CultureWise system works for about 98% of all companies. But if you want something else, you probably should talk to somebody else.
Right.
Because this is what we do.
Right.
And we've got it down to a science. So we've
And we're
broken
going to run
it down.
those 4 plays really well.
I think that's a great way of thinking of it. In fact, I've broken it down to 4 steps. There are 4 steps to doing this. It's the 4 plays. And these are the 4 steps, these are the 4 plays that the Green Bay Packers run. And we know exactly how to do it. And we've done it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And it works and it's effective. And so we will take you to the promised land and we'll implement. And so keeping it simple is key.
How do you overcome the numbness of repetitiveness? So like, you've got people in your company, they know that the first 3 to 5 minutes of each meeting is going to be this fundamental we're talking about or whatever. How do you keep people from literally just, oh yeah, this is just another, we just got to tick the box here so we can make David happy, in meetings. Okay, we did our 3 minutes. So now next, how do you get,
that's a great question. Yeah. And I would say that's probably the question that our existing clients ask the most. Okay, we've been doing this for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. How do we keep it from becoming stale and kind of losing the emphasis of that? And so there's 2 parts to that answer. The first part is that the most important way to keep it from becoming stale and meaningless is to create interaction or engagement. So in other words, if we're kicking off that meeting, if I stand up and I read the fundamental or lecture about it, it's likely to start going in one ear and out the other. If I ask questions of people to engage them in a thoughtful dialogue, now your brain is participating, you're engaged, you're thinking, you're participating. Now it stays more alive.
Right.
So everywhere we can in our rituals, we want to look for opportunities to create interaction and engagement versus one-way communications.
And that's an expectation of people that are coming to the meeting that they will engage with this 3 to 5 minutes, or is it like kind of, okay, John, you're Shelley, you lead the fundamental this week, or John, you do
both.
this.
And I would say companies do this at varying, I mean, they all do that ritual. Some of them do it better than others.
Right.
And so we give them a lot of coaching about best practices for how to lead a fundamental, because a fundamental of the week discussion, if they don't know how to do it, it's still fine, but it's not as robust as if you have somebody who knows how to engage the audience.
Right. Right.
And so learning how to do that is helpful, not required, but better. So the first thing is make it interactive. The second part of the answer to your question, though, is to some extent, it doesn't matter. And what I mean by that is that, there's a couple of analogies I sometimes use on this question. And my first analogy is I'll say to people, do you think when Michael Jordan won his first championship, he stopped practicing free throws? No, it's just what you do. It's just part of the routine. And so it's nice if you can mix it up, but I never want people to think, unless we find lots of ways to mix it up, this will never work. No, it's just what we do around here.
Right.
Or another analogy sometimes that I use to think of it is like, we all know that we get up in the morning, we brush our teeth. Do you sit there and say, you know what? I think today I'm going to do it standing on one foot because I'm getting kind of bored the way I've been brushing my teeth. So I got to find a new way to do it. And so that's okay. There's some value to just consistency. It doesn't have to all be changed. And so I try to remind people that when they get into this trap of thinking, well, it might get stale. You know what? It's what we do around here.
Right. Right. But I mean, you've got to be a little more creative than that when you're responding to clients that are saying, how do we keep this from getting boring, whatever. You probably don't turn to, hey, it's just what we do.
Well, to some degree, I mean, I give them the same 2 answers I just gave you. Here are some things you can do, but I do say to them, I don't want you to get into the trap of thinking, unless we can find lots of different ways this won't work.
Right.
No, there's value in consistency.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to give you some kudos here. I've interviewed people for, every week for about 3 years. And I am struggling to remember a guest that I think had their product down as well as you do.
Well, I
Every
appreciate it.
question I've asked you, you've had a good answer for. And you're thinking, even if you say, Kevin, that was a good question, you're like, but here's the answer, because we've actually crossed that bridge before. Every bridge
We
you
have
you
crossed most
I
bridges.
was going to say, we have
Yes.
already kind of set that stage. So
Well, yeah, and I
that
appreciate
instills
that. And
confidence.
yeah, I
You know?
appreciate that. And it's that I have, probably because I created all of this stuff.
Mm,
So, I've birthed this, and I've written 3 books on it, and I've given 500 workshops on it
right.
and worked with hundreds of clients. And so it just works. But
Hmm.
I know the kinds of challenges that people face, and they're, real challenges, but we know how to work with them.
Right.
It just works.
So let's step into 2020, and
Mm.
you know how, I mean, the companies that you're dealing with. I mean, obviously, most everything went virtual, and I'm
Mm.
assuming that before that, majority of your work was probably done on site,
That's correct.
and in maybe small groups or larger presentations or
Mhm.
whatever. But how do were companies reluctant to move to a virtual form of this, and did it affect your pricing structure? Did it affect, I mean, what impact did it have on your business? And then how
Yeah.
did you kind of walk companies through this process, with through CultureWise?
Yeah, it did certainly affect us. So I would say in the second quarter of 2020, when everybody was like in panic mode,
Yep.
oh my God, what are we going to do?
Right.
Everybody just like everything shut down, and people, initiatives that they were getting ready to launch, time out, everything's on
Yep.
hold. We just got to deal with this. So everything
Global
kind of
pause
stopped.
button. Yeah.
Once we got into the third quarter and people started to realize, all right, you know what? Life goes on. We'll just do everything virtually. We started to do most of what we do virtually.
Hmm.
And so the process that we take them through, as a leadership team, is now almost always done virtually.
Hmm.
What we call the rollouts, where it gets introduced to all the employees, which used to be in person, that's all become 90% virtual.
Right.
And what I would say, and thankfully with Zoom, it's pretty easy to do, as you
Yep.
know,
Yep.
and you can use breakout groups to break them into small groups and make it
Hmm.
really interactive. And so we found that it's actually really effective virtually.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, the way that I sometimes say it to a client is, if we can be there in person, that's the best way to do it. But
Hmm.
if I were to compare the virtual process to the in-person process on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 meaning virtual is exactly the same, just as good as in person, I would say it's an 8, eight and a
Hmm.
half.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's a 3. It's
Right.
it's not the same,
Right.
but it's really good. And in some cases, what we've discovered is, in some cases, it's actually better logistically. So you have a company that has, 6 locations with
Sure.
people. You can mix and match people from all
Yep.
different locations.
Yep.
And so, or they've got the traveling salespeople. So even before the pandemic, they've got their, corporate staff, and they got 30 traveling salespeople around the country. Well, you know what? We can do this all remotely. So there are
Yep.
times where doing it remotely is actually better,
Right.
logistically.
Right.
So we've just learned that we can do it remotely and do it very effectively. So I think as we come out of the pandemic eventually, I think what we'll see is we will continue to do a lot of them
Hmm.
remotely. There are
Well, how many
times,
companies are going to a blended,
I think so,
workforce
absolutely.
or remote
Yeah,
completely workforce?
I think so for
Yeah.
sure. Now, there's some, if you've got a manufacturing company,
Right.
they kind of need to be in the
It's hard to
plant,
do
and
that.
we
Yeah.
need to be physically there with
Yeah.
them because they're not really on computers.
Right.
But we will do a lot. I think, if I were to predict a year from now and say, what percentage of our work are we doing virtually, I would be willing to bet that we're probably doing more than half of our work virtually.
Well, that would be, I mean, now, right now, that's not a shift because
Right.
almost everyone's still working, in a
Yes.
remote setting or whatever. But once, like you said, once we go back, it's interesting. I mean, I hear everything all over the horizon about that prediction,
Mhm.
because there are still so many of those old mainline companies that are like going,
Mhm.
how do we keep an eye on our people if they're not
Right.
sitting here at their desk?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, then you didn't hire the right people. If you can't trust them,
Yes.
then you didn't hire the right people.
Yes.
So, you're just going to have to, wake up and boomer, and like we are, it
Yes.
was really funny. You mentioned something really early about, you kind of dated yourself, and
Yep.
you were like, well, you spoke in almost that you said, well, we did it this way back then. And I'm thinking, buddy, I'm older than you are. So
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So that was, it's interesting. I do think I'm like a millennial, trapped in a boomer suit. So it's interesting to kind of see that perspective. But
Yeah.
as we, there's so many ways I can just keep you here, and continue to ask you questions, and then, you wouldn't get
Happy
to go
to.
home at night. But what have we not touched on that you just would like to wrap us up with today, that, kind of tie a neat little bow around this, and then just tell people where the best place to find you?
Yeah. So I would say, if I were to tie a nice bow around it, I'll do sort of two bows around this. So um, the first bow I would put around this is a broader one than just this topic. And it's that one of my, it relates to what we've been saying, but one of my pet peeves is I hate secrets. When you hear book titles and business people talk about the 3 secrets to this and the 5
Mhm.
secrets to that, the implication that there are secrets that only certain people know, and maybe on this podcast, I'll reveal one of those secrets. Oh, I hate that, because it's the implication that that's why you haven't had the success you want, because you didn't know the secret. And if I shared
Right.
the secret, it would all become easy. God, that's so terrible. And so I don't even, when I see titles like that, it just turns me off, because what I have found is that virtually everything I've ever learned that I thought was significant, after I learned it, it's like, this is not rocket science. That what it takes to be successful is not some mystery. You just got to do it. I was reading a blog by an author a few months ago, and it just struck a chord in me. And he was talking about how to write a book. And he said, he's written a number of books. I've written 3 of them. And he was saying that he gets people writing into him saying, how do you do that? I wish I could write a book. And his blog was about, how you write a book? You sit down and you write every day. And when you're done, you got a book. But it's like, this isn't some big secret. You do it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people are looking for some mysterious secrets, and there aren't any. And it goes back to what we were talking about before
Mhm.
with the Green Bay Packers and the 4
Right.
plays. This
Exactly.
isn't that complicated. You do some pretty simple things and it works. So
Right.
when it comes to culture, my point of view and experience, and I think it's why this material resonates with leaders, is because I break it down. This isn't complicated. When you break it all down, I say it this way. So here's my tying it in a bow for you. If you want to get any group of human beings to behave in some consistent manner, whether that group of human beings is called your kids, or the athletes of the team you're coaching, or your church congregation, or your company, doesn't it make logical sense that you would dramatically improve the probabilities of success? And that's all, we're just stacking the odds in our favor. Humans are humans, they do weird things, we don't control them, but we're stacking the odds heavily in our favor if, number one, we were crystal clear about exactly what we wanted from them. Except we're usually not. We're just annoyed that they're not being how we want them to be.
Right.
Or we have these vague values and we think that tells them something. And number two, wouldn't we further dramatically improve the probabilities of success if we not only were clear about what we wanted, but we had a structured, systematic way to teach those behaviors over and over and over and over and over and over again? Wouldn't that dramatically improve the chances of success? That just makes sense. That's all I've done.
And that,
That
folks,
it
is
just
your
makes
elevator
sense.
pitch
It
for
is.
CultureWise and the system that David's company teaches. So, David,
That's
where's the best
simple.
place to find you online?
Yeah, best place to find me online is CultureWise. So the word culture and then WISE. CultureWise.com is our website. My email address is david@culturewise.com. And you can find my books online on Amazon. So the books are fundamentally different, and then Culture by Design. And then the new version, I just released the 2nd edition of Culture by Design, which is really the how-to. And all of that's on Amazon, and it's in hardcover, softcover, paper, ebook, and also the audiobook. And I do the audiobook versions
Okay.
too.
Well, if you'll send me those links, I'll make sure that they get in the show
I'll do
notes.
it.
And I mean, it's not that difficult to look up CultureWise. And tell me
Yes.
the book title again.
Culture by Design.
Culture by Design on
Yes,
Amazon, and you'll certainly
exactly.
be able to
And
find
look,
it.
I mean, both editions are great, but the newer edition, what I added in the second edition that just came out is the remote workforce. So I just took all the material that I'd written in the previous book and adapted it for. So how does this apply with remote workforce?
Right.
So when you look it up, you'll see both versions, but you probably want the second edition. They're the same price, but the second edition adds the whole remote workforce aspect to it.
What great timing with coming out of COVID, and
Yes,
as we're moving into this kind of new normal workforce and how it could
yes.
apply. So, David, I just want to thank you again for taking the time tonight and just to share your story, and it's been a pleasure to kind of hear you unpack, something that you know so fundamentally well, and that you literally, it's more than that. It's actually part of your DNA. You can just
It
tell that,
is.
as you see and hear you interact. And but really, just I just love the way that you have kind of taught through, sharing tonight, and really playing your part in helping all boats rise in a rising tide. David, have a great evening.
Thank you. My pleasure, Kevin.
Another episode in the books. We hope you heard some great takeaways. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a 5-star review on iTunes and YouTube. As always, thanks for listening to Rising Tide.